I don't have any props today. We are talking about rats. I don't own a rat. I've never owned a rat. I had hamsters for a while, but not having a rat isn't a big deal. It just means we don't have a small animal running around on set, which would be kind of a pain in the butt anyway. Speaking of butts, today we're going to be talking about butt-licking rats. Let's go! We're going to be talking about a couple of studies today, studies that were done on rats, and rats are often used early on in experimental studies. They're very easy to get a hold of, they reproduce very quickly, and they have a lot of chemical things and bits of their body that are similar to the way our own and other animals' bodies work. So it's a good starter, so you can figure it out, and then later on, you can refine your study so that you can do it on humans. Several of these studies were in the 60s and 70s. But the one we're going to be starting with was actually done in 2003 onwards. The first paper was 2003. And it's about butt-licking rats. Now, rats have a set of behaviors that they do when they're grooming their child. When they're raising their child. And they're grooming, licking, nuzzling. They do this like smother hug where they just lay on top of the baby rats in a comforting way. But they do lick their butts. And the reason they lick their butts is not only for grooming, but it helps them figure out how to poop, which is weird, but that's why they're licking their butts. And in these studies, they were looking at the difference in amount of licking, grooming, nuzzling, cuddling that different rat mothers did. And they saw that a rat mother who spent more time nurturing, licking, grooming their babies had less neurotic and less stressed baby rats. Now, that kind of makes sense. It's on the front of it's like you take care of your babies, they're going to be well adjusted. You don't take care of their babies, they're going to be maladjusted. But the piece of this that's interesting is that in looking at this, they not only figured out, one, what kind of chemical signals were adding to the neuroticism of these baby rats, but also that it was an epigenetic and inheritable thing, which means that it's not in the genome, it's not part of the DNA, but it's in all the markers around the DNA. And so this nurturing, grooming, butt licking expressed a chemical called oxytocin. You'll sometimes referred to as the love chemical. It's expressed in orgasm, and it's also expressed with long hugs. It's expressed with familial love. It's expressed with maternal and paternal love and caring. But it's this hormone that gets loose in your body and makes you care about the other person. It's a bonding chemical. It's kind of a way to think about it. So when the mother rats are doing their grooming stuff, oxytocin is released. And that oxytocin leads to changes in the epigenetic portion of the rat. Now, you hear epigenetic and it kind of sounds weird because you go, okay, there's genetics, and I get that, I get DNA. Cool, I remember crossbreeding beans to make different colors and the Punnett squares to figure out what would happen. Okay, but what's epigenetic, Justin? Epigenetic is a series of markers around and inside of the cell that hang out near the DNA. It's usually in the form of methyl chains and amino acids, and their presence or lack changes what parts of the DNA are expressed during meiosis and mitosis, okay? So now, where that gets weird, and where it seems strange that they shouldn't be heritable, they are. And they are in a weird way, and I'm not 100% sure what the full mechanisms are, because it feels like, to me, this is the way I'm reading it, it feels like the presence or absence of those methyl groups changes whether or not they're going to engage in nurturing or low nurturing behavior, which contributes to the development of oxytocin, which contributes to methyl groups. So those epigenetic markers, they fill in this space and make it so that this generational change can occur. So back to the study. What they did is they had observed groups of low licking and high licking rats. There are always going to be some degree of licking. There's no licking. No licking and babies die. They don't know how to relieve themselves. They kind of become a mess and get diseased and die. So there's low licking and high licking. And then they took babies from each group and swapped them. So the low licking rats would have babies who has mothers were low licking rats, who had babies who has mothers were low licking rats. It just passed on that way. And it has to do with how stressed they are. A higher stressed rat isn't going to go as far from the nest. A higher stressed rat isn't going to be as adventurous when trying to find new food sources. A low stress rat, on the other hand, is adventurous, is curious, is going to venture further from the nest, is going to try to find new food sources, and is going to generally have a better developmental chance. But, and these are both heritable, right? They're generational, they stay the same. But when you take half of the brood from a low lick mother and half of the brood from a high lick mother and swap them, the low lick stays low licky, even to the generational children of the mother. That means it's not genes, it's an epigenetic change by environment that is heritable by behavior. Just super weird. The ones that get put back over here with the high licking, high nurturing mothers, they get adventurous. They get curious. So it looks like there's a way that this is not only inheritable, but arrestable and reversible. So the first study that came out with this was called, and it's by the same group, it's Michael Meany and Francis Champagne. In 2003 was Variations in Maternal Care in the Rat as a Mediating Influence for the Effect of Environment on Development. They're directly stating that what happens during the developmental process of a baby rat is due to environment and the expression of genes due to environment. Then when they got into this and they wrote their second paper on this in 2007, it was called Stress During Gestation Alters Postpartum Maternal Care and the Development of the Offspring in a Rodent Model. That last piece is key, because while we are talking about rats here, there's not a direct human piece. And we'll talk about that bit later too. But the idea here, and what I want you to hold on to as we talk about the next two studies, is that they put this study together. They did it. They had really interesting results. They did it again, and then they started doing interesting things. They said, okay, what's the mechanism? Can we measure the oxytocin? And they said, yeah, look. Higher oxytocin in the high licky rats, lower oxytocin in the low licky rats. And that leads to a difference in the amount of methionine, which is a source of methyl, in the rats that changes the markers around the cell when it divides. And those change how often they produce or react to or bond oxytocin. So there's a direct chemical behavior, there's a direct physical result, and it's generationally inherited because of the behaviors that result. To try it even further, they were able to, for the super comfortable, not nervous at all rats, they gave them a drug that wiped the methyl, and they got super anxious. They turned into low licky rats, behaviorally. For the low licky rats, they gave them methionine, which is a high source of methyl. And when they injected that directly into the brain and it bonded to the cell where meiosis and mitosis would occur, they became high licky rats. So there's this direct brain thing that they're being able to manipulate and show that that's what's causing it. This is a very, very solid study. It's very well done. It has really nice pieces, and each conclusion goes to another part that follows. So keep that in mind, because when I make some conclusions later on, I want you to remember how good this study is compared with the next one we're going to talk about. And the next one we're going to talk about is called Rat Park. Rat Park is in the 1960s, and it is Bruce Alexander, and he's looking into drug addiction, and withdrawal. And the hypothesis he was testing is that drug addiction is not so much a result of the chemical addictive properties, but of an environmental and relationship lack. And he came to that conclusion by putting morphine into caged rats, little 1 foot square cages, metal with the water thing in it. He put morphine and water in there, and the rats would self-administer morphine. They'd just go after the morphine. He went, okay, so a rat in isolation gets high to have an experience. Okay, what if I make a place, I'm gonna call it Rat Park, and in Rat Park, we're gonna have plenty of room, we're gonna have plenty of paper to make nests, we're gonna have both genders and bunches of rats so that the rats can all meet each other and hang out and have rat encounters of the making more rat kind. And we'll give them both waters as well. In Rat Park, the rats didn't drink the morphine water. They drank the regular water and just ignored the morphine. Now, there's problems with this study. And so the conclusions that he comes to from seeing this happen is saying, you know what, maybe the problem is not getting addicted to the drug. Maybe the problem is a lack of intersocial relationships, and that drives people to seek out that chemical piece in a different way. And he started doing things where he'd get rats addicted to morphine. They'd 60, 70 days with just morphine water, no regular water. Then he'd put them in Rat Park, and they would ignore the morphine water and go to regular water and have minor withdrawal symptoms. So he has this study. It leads to Johann Hari has a TED Talk where he discusses relationship as a source of addiction instead of a biological, chemical dependence. So there's some problems with this study that were kind of looked at and known. One is it's a very small sample size. It's a group, a population of less than 50 rats, all told, involved in the study. Morphine is bitter when it's in water, so they had to sweeten the water to get the rats to drink it at all. And you have a lot of things in it that go kind of interesting but sideways. And when an attempt is made to replicate this study by one of his students, they are unable to do so. They do not get the same results. They do not see the addicted rats withdraw. They do not see the change in morphine. Because when Bruce was doing this, when Dr. Alexander was doing this, the morphine rats in the cages by themselves were self-administering almost 19 times more than the Rat Park ones. But when they try and replicate it, they're not getting these same results. And there's a theory that that's because of the type of rats that were used, because it was a different genetic strain of rat. There was a theory that it was incidental to other environmental factors in the lab. And so they come out of this, and even Johann Hari's TED Talk, the journalist, it's drawing conclusions that are interesting, but not as solid. So remember our first study when we were talking about Meany and Champagne and the butt-licking rats. Lots of follow-up. They find and identify a behavior, look for a mechanism. In this one, it looks like they find a behavior. They don't find a mechanism. They're not able to replicate it, and they aren't able to do secondary studies that could show what's actually happening in the brain and why that would happen. The last study we're going to talk about is a mice study. So we've done 2 rats and now a mouse. The guy that did it is a biologist called John Calhoun, and he built it at the National Institute of Mental Health. This is in Maryland in 1968. And he built a whole bunch of different environments for mice and then let their population go and see what happens. He was trying to make the most perfect environment for mice. And in 1968, he built a utopia called Number 25. And Number 25, in July of 1968, he brought 8 albino mice into this 4.5-foot cube. Following an adjustment period, the first pups were born 3.5 months later, and the population doubled every 55 days afterward. This is from sciencehistory.org, by the way. They did a really nice write-up of the study. The study itself is a little denser, but this is a more pop way to read it. So what we're seeing happen in this environment that he built, and this environment is lush. It has wheels for the mice to run in. It has ample nesting materials. It has a dirt floor to dig. It has little rat cabanas. There's like 55 attached by wire tubes to the wall where they can go and be private and alone. It has plenty of food. It has all the resources that a rat population would need to flourish. And it does. It doubles every 55 days until it hits 2,200 mice during the 19th month. So about a year and a half into this, it has 2,200 mice off of original 8 mice. Okay. So in this utopia, some of the things that some of the things that mice normally experience are taken away. And here's what I mean by that. So rats have social hierarchies. There's they compete for females that are kept in little harems of several girl mice. So when a mouse establishes itself as a stronger mouse in this group and gets a harem, the other mice that come to compete with him don't have any sexual outlet. They don't have a relationship outlet. They're just kind of left alone. And so you see these rejected males start gathering in the center of the nest and just having fights, kicking and scratching and biting. And they're fighting like they're fighting for a harem, but they're not competing for any female attention. Some of them become disaffected and spend all day long grooming, licking, cleaning, and preening themselves. They start calling these the beautiful ones. And they seem entirely uninterested in not only sex, but the display and push of the fight to prove themselves for sex. And so you have these beautiful ones, you have this mob of mice that are fighting, and then you have the alphas. These top tier mice that have these harems, though, are consistently seeing incursions from new mice on the scene. So they're in a constant level of stress. Because there's enough food for all enough food for all the mice that need to eat it, the normal death toll on baby mice isn't happening. Because normally it's a pretty high death toll. Now they're having more kids than they can take care of, handle, or nurture as mothers. And so this leads to an eventual breakdown. And what they see happen is the perfect utopia. All the food they need, all the stimulation they need, hits a population peak of 2,200 and then declines. And it declines to the point where there are no more rats. The last one dies in 1973. They went from 8 albino mice to 2,200 mice to 0 mice in the span of 5 years. In theoretically what would be the perfect environment to sustain a certain size population of mice. Now, the losing mice were missing something that they'd had in the wild, which is that they couldn't escape. Normally a losing mice would go find another group, go be a part of a different group, and wouldn't stick around and be stuck there. So there's the problem of the containment of this cage in this study. And you also have this weird cycle of higher stress and changes in mortality that lead to a lack of interest in reproduction and sexual activity. So this study leads to 2 really interesting things in the world. One is a journalist named One is a biologist, Paul Ehrlich. He publishes a book called The Population Boom, and it theorizes that the same problem is going to affect humanity, but sooner. And it's going to affect us because we are not going to be able to increase the amount of food we need to survive at the rate that the population is growing. There's a lot of reasons he was wrong, but it was an interesting piece. It caught the zeitgeist, and it ended up with books like Soylent Green and the Charlton Heston movie, Soylent Green, it's people. But it also led to people thinking, okay, well, if it's perfect for them, is there a point at which they start to become like us? And this leads directly to the book by Robert C. O'Brien called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. NIMH, it's National Institute of Mental Health. It's where the study took place. In the book, they have a lot of really good flashbacks to the mice and rats in the study, and they were giving them chemicals to make them smarter to the point where they could read language, and they escape and they live under a rose bush. Don Bluth got the rights to this, and he made The Secret of Nim, a movie that was his first foray into independent features. It changed from being Mrs. Frisbee to Mrs. Brisbee because he reached out to Frisbee and said, hey, this is called Mrs. Frisbee. Are we going to have a copyright problem? And Frisbee said, yeah, I think we will. You should change it. They'd already recorded a bunch of the voice acting, so they had to change wherever they said Mrs. Frisbee to Mrs. Brisbee. It's not really noticeable, which is phenomenal for the time. But it has more weird elements in it. Like in the book, there's no magical element. In the movie, there's this shining red crystal thing that has magical powers. Nicodemus is a wizard. It's strange. The book sits closely to the ideas that were presented in the experiment. So we have these 3 studies. And so if we want to make comparisons between our behavior, our raising, our potential, and rats and mice, we have to caveat that and say a lot of things. We have to say that we are not rats and don't behave the same way we are. We have to add that our environment has coddled us to the point that we don't have a lot of the stressors that we would have. However, we do still have stressors and we do still have changes in behavior. And the reason we can compare these to ourselves is that first study I was talking about, the Buttlicken study. Yeah. So Murgatroyd and Wu in 2009 looked at it in people. And they had a study they did called Dynamic DNA Methylation Programs, Persistent Adverse Effects of Early Life Stress. And they looked at the stress during childhood and what it would contribute to as you aged. And so they start seeing these same comparisons as the licky rats in the first study. And with that, I think we have a really strong reason to cross that study over and use it to discuss people. I don't know if we have a strong reason to use the addiction study with the morphine, or the study with the rat society crescendo to 2200 and dropped to 0, and the population bomb stuff. For the population bomb, it's If Books Could Kill is an excellent podcast, and it talks about the population bomb and a lot of the reasons they were in error. But on this one, right, Buttlicken study, we bring it over to people and we start having a really good argument for why we need things like libraries and affirmative action and DEI programs. Now, we have this very American mindset of the individual, being able to do it yourself, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, which does not mean pull yourself up by the bootstraps like we use it now. It literally used to mean something that couldn't be done. So that's been adopted and kind of shifted. But that idea that you are individually responsible for everything that happens to you is asinine. And this study is one of the reasons why, as well as the odds or luck of where and when you were born. So if you look at this study and think about it in terms of people, I can't help but remember what my dad told me when he was teaching math. He taught math at the high school level for 30-something years. But he had some kids that had problems learning math. And he couldn't figure out why until he started talking to him and going, hey, what do we need? How do we get this passed? And he started finding out that there were other problems. So my dad one day said to me, it's really hard to learn trigonometry if you don't know where you're sleeping tonight. And that stuck with me, that idea that your home environment is gonna color who you can become, not just environmentally and access to resources, but physiologically. It changes your brain and what you can do with it. So, when we look at historically underprivileged communities, you start to say, what is the stress in these communities doing to people? Poverty is the biggest indicator. And when you have certain cultural groups that are in more poverty than others, you end up with this generational effect. And that's what we try to correct for. That's what we try and help with these programs. So even if you make a program that's just to help out people in poverty, it will have a disproportionate effect on certain communities because they are more often in poverty. So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are programs that are on college campuses and in not just universities, but also in organizations, corporate world. The benefit of these is you start looking at people not through a lens of, here's the individual, how many widgets did they make? What products did they deliver for us? but you start going, here's the individual. Are there issues that they have encountered that is making it harder for them to produce widgets and ideas? And if there are those things, are there things that we can do to help them? Now, in that, I am not advocating for injecting drugs into the brain or to try and change where the methyl pieces land or having a thing where we normalize and everybody has it the same. I'm saying that this kind of empathy isn't just a kind of soft, feel-good, I like people that like to think about how I think about things. This is a biological piece. Empathy for somebody else can come from a space of, I understand that your physical world and your physical brain are different than mine because of what happened and where you were as a child. And that acceptance and that empathy is what I want to advocate for on this. To say, be open to what the effect of somebody else's childhood has on their behavior. And don't write it off. Just think about it as it happens and see what conversations you can have to understand that better. So I guess what I'm really saying here, America, is go out and lick a rat's ass. For Weekly Dad News, I've been Justin. Bye.